It was early evening when I heard the gentle tap at my door. Not urgent, but not entirely casual, either hesitant, as though whoever stood on the other side wasn't quite certain they should be there at all. I stood at the kitchen sink, finishing the last dinner dish, the fragrance of herb-roasted chicken still warming the air. Through the window, the sky had painted itself in soft watercolors of amber and lavender that only spring evenings seemed to create. Everything felt peaceful, ordinary. That tap changed everything. I dried my hands on the cotton towel hanging beside the stove, smoothed my sweater, and walked to the entrance. I rarely received visitors these days. Life had grown quieter since William passed. A gentle rhythm of gardening, novels, and weekly teas with Margaret from my literature circle. When I opened the door, there stood Thomas, my next door neighbor. We'd exchanged pleasant greetings across fences and brief conversations while collecting mail or tending to our yards. He was somewhat younger than me, divorced I'd heard, and had moved in perhaps a season ago. Always courteous, reserved, with kind eyes that seemed to notice more than they revealed. He looked nervous that evening, holding a small basket wrapped in checkered cloth. "Hello, Eleanor," he said, his voice slightly rough, as though he'd practiced what to say before walking over. "Sorry to arrive unannounced like this, but I made too many muffins and thought, well, perhaps you might enjoy some." I blinked in surprise. Muffins? It was the last thing I'd expected. Something fluttered inside me. Not excitement exactly, not yet, but curiosity. A man bringing home made baked goods at sunset. That hadn't happened since university days. I smiled, perhaps too warmly. "That's incredibly thoughtful, Thomas. I'd love some. Would you care to come inside? I've just brewed tea if you're not hurrying elsewhere." He hesitated briefly, just long enough to make me wonder if I'd been too forward, then nodded. "Tea sounds lovely." We sat in the garden room where the last daylight streamed through the windows, bathing everything in honey, gold light. I poured chamomile into the porcelain cups William and I once shared on cool evenings. There was something strangely comforting about it, familiar yet new. Thomas wasn't particularly talkative, and neither was I these days, but the quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt warm, gentle, as though we were sharing something without requiring words. He mentioned he'd recently begun baking as a hobby, said it helped quiet his thoughts after long days working from his home office. I found myself listening intently to each word, noticing how his forehead creased slightly when he spoke about his teenage daughter who lived primarily with her mother. "I miss her," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Strange, isn't it? You nurture them, love them with everything inside you, and then suddenly they become part of someone else's daily life." I nodded, understanding more than he could know. That aching space children leave behind when they grow into their own worlds. "That's not strange at all," I said gently. "It's simply parenthood, perhaps the hardest part, learning to let go." Our eyes met momentarily, and I glimpsed something. Recognition, perhaps. A kindred melancholy beneath years of resilience and carrying on. When he left an hour later, after 3 muffins and 2 refills of tea, I felt something awaken that had been dormant for quite some time. A warmth in my chest, a glimmer. That night, as I slipped into bed, the basket he'd brought still resting on the counter with 1 muffin remaining inside, I gazed at the ceiling and wondered, was it merely neighborly kindness or something more? I told myself not to read meaning into it. I was older now. It was just being neighborly, nothing else. But a quiet voice in my heart whispered something I hadn't permitted myself to hear in years. It's all right to feel again. And for the first time in many seasons, I didn't silence that voice. Several days passed before I saw Thomas again. I'd convinced myself the tea and muffins were a one-time gesture of neighborly goodwill. Still, whenever I passed the garden room or glanced toward his home, I felt an unfamiliar flutter beneath my ribs. Foolish, I chided myself. Childish. But that didn't prevent me from listening more attentively for footsteps outside or spending extra moments with my hair in the mirror. Then came the weekend. The day had warmed unexpectedly, offering hints of summer. I'd spent the morning tending to the rose bushes along the fence when I heard a voice call out, "Need assistance?" I turned to find Thomas standing at the edge of his yard, sleeves rolled up, garden spade in one hand, and a playful smile on his face. "I'm attempting to make my garden look half as lovely as yours," he added, nodding toward the blooms of crimson and gold lining my walkway. "But I suspect I'm just digging holes and hoping for miracles." I laughed, wiping my brow with my gloved wrist. "Well, miracles and proper mulching are practically the same in gardening." He chuckled and rested the spade against the fence. "Actually, I was wondering something else. Would you consider joining me for dinner tonight? Nothing elaborate, just something I'm preparing. I'd appreciate the company." I froze momentarily. I thought perhaps I'd misheard or imagined the invitation entirely, but his expression was earnest, hopeful yet uncertain. Dinner with a man at his home. I hadn't experienced that situation in goodness more than a decade. I smiled, more measured this time. "I'd enjoy that, Thomas." His home mirrored him perfectly tidy, understated, with personal touches revealing more than he likely realized. Framed photographs of his daughter adorned the hallway, and bookshelves overflowing with travel guides occupied the sitting room. On the table, he'd arranged candles just two, nothing extravagant, and prepared a shepherd's pie that filled the space with the kind of aroma that instantly creates comfort. As we ate, conversation flowed more naturally than before. We discussed our pasts, not merely facts, but the spaces between them. "I always imagined retiring to a coastal village," he said with a wistful smile, "opening a small cafe near the water. But circumstances had different plans." I nodded. "William and I dreamed of sailing along the coast. We'd even selected the boat. Then his heart failed too soon." The words emerged more easily than expected. Usually I avoided speaking of William. It felt somewhat like betrayal, but with Thomas it didn't. He didn't look away or offer empty consolations. He simply listened. After dinner, we moved to the back veranda. The sky had transformed into soft velvet, stars beginning to emerge. The silence remained comfortable, accompanied by the song of evening insects and distant wind chimes from a nearby garden. "I'm glad you came," he said quietly, his voice low. "It's been quite some time since this house felt like more than a place to sleep." I observed him then, really saw him. The gentle lines surrounding his eyes, the way his hands rested on the chair arms, steady and strong. And then he did something unexpected again. He reached for my hand. He didn't grasp it or pull it toward him. He simply allowed his fingers to brush against mine, a quiet invitation. I hesitated, not because I didn't desire the connection, but because I'd forgotten how it felt to be touched with such consideration. There was no urgency, just warmth, respect, the kind of connection that says, "I see you, and I want to understand who you are." I let my fingers curl around his. We remained that way, hands resting between us, two souls tethered by something unspoken, something authentic. When I finally walked home beneath the stars, my heart beat slower, not racing with nervousness or uncertainty, but pulsing with a peculiar calm, a steadiness I hadn't realized I missed. That night, I sat by the window and wrote in my journal for the first time in years. Just one sentence: something is awakening in me once more. I didn't know where it might lead, but I understood this much: it wasn't merely about a neighbor anymore. It was about possibility, about rediscovering a version of myself I thought had faded with time. And for the first time in many seasons, I felt curious about tomorrow. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since that evening on Thomas's veranda, since that gentle touch, since I allowed someone in, even just slightly. And in the quiet that followed, life settled into a different rhythm. Subtle shifts, small gestures. Thomas waved from his kitchen window when I watered the garden. He left a freshly baked loaf at my doorstep one morning with a note that simply read, "Still practicing. Let me know if I'm improving." It wasn't grand or dramatic or the stuff of novels, but it was genuine. One afternoon, after a brief shower had left the pavements damp, and the air fragrant with wet earth and blossoms, he called. "Hello," he said. "I know it's rather spontaneous, but I could use a walk. Would you like company?" I didn't hesitate. "I'll get my jacket." We met at the corner of our street, where ancient oak trees arched above the sidewalk like protective sentinels. The clouds were beginning to part, allowing slender beams of sunlight to touch the ground. Everything felt newly cleansed. We walked unhurriedly, not from caution, but because neither of us rushed to reach any destination. There was something in the atmosphere that day, a quiet energy making everything feel more vibrant. We discussed simple matters initially: his work, my latest attempt to revive the tomato plants. Then, as we turned onto the path through the community gardens, the conversation deepened effortlessly. "I used to walk this trail with her," Thomas said softly. "My daughter when she was small. She loved gathering wooden objects and pretending they were enchanted. Once she gave me a tiny bird carving and told me it would shield me from grown-up sadness." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Do you still have it?" I asked gently. He nodded. "Top drawer of my bedside table. Whenever I consider putting it away, I simply can't." I paused, then reached out and took his hand again, as I had that night on the veranda. This time there was no hesitation. "I think it's still working," I said. He stopped walking then, right beneath a flowering cherry tree, and looked at me in a way that made my breath catch. "Eleanor, I didn't believe I could feel this way again. I never anticipated. You and we've both lived full lives." I smiled. "We have, and we've both experienced loss. But perhaps that's precisely why this matters." He nodded slowly, then reached into his coat pocket and withdrew something. A small wooden figurine, barely larger than a walnut. He turned it in his palm and then gently placed it in mine. "You need protection too," he said. My throat tightened. I wasn't accustomed to tenderness like this anymore, but in that moment I realized something I hadn't dared acknowledge. I was beginning to trust again. We continued walking, hands clasped, the wooden bird warm against my palm. We passed children on bicycles, couples with carriages, the scent of fresh grass and damp petals rising around us. And somewhere along that winding path, I understood I wasn't just allowing someone in. I was letting myself out, letting myself laugh without guilt, be seen without shame, hope without fear. When we reached the end of the trail, the sun had descended, casting long shadows across the pavement. "I don't want to say good night just yet," he said. I turned to him and smiled. "Then don't." He took a breath and stepped closer, eyes searching mine. Not rushing, not demanding, just asking a question in silence. I nodded, and for the first time in what felt like another lifetime, I felt the gentle press of lips against mine. Not fireworks, not some cinematic spectacle, but warmth, familiarity, a promise of something that might grow slowly, quietly, if we allowed it. That night, I didn't write in my journal. I didn't need to, because I already knew how the next entry would begin. I think I'm falling, and I'm not afraid this time. The morning after that kiss, everything appeared slightly transformed. It wasn't that the world had changed. It was how I was seeing it. The way I lingered by the window longer with my coffee, watching early light stretch across the garden. The way my shoulders felt somewhat lighter, the air somewhat warmer, even though the forecast predicted clouds. Something inside me had shifted. And perhaps that's what happens when you permit yourself to feel again not just the joy, but the vulnerability too. The uncertainty, the possibility. Thomas called later that day, his voice gentler than usual. May I visit? I told him yes before he finished asking. He arrived with 2 coffees and a nervous smile. I hope this doesn't seem rushed, he said, offering me the cup. I couldn't stop thinking about last night. I gestured to the chair opposite mine in the garden room. Neither could I. We sat for a considerable time, sipping our drinks, allowing the silence to speak where words would only interfere. Then he looked at me, really looked. You frighten me a little, Elinor, he said. I raised an eyebrow, half smiling. Me? He nodded. Because this feels authentic, and I haven't allowed anything to feel genuine in a very long time. I understood that better than I could express. I'd structured my life after William around quiet patterns, safe boundaries, predictable days. It was an existence that didn't demand too much of me, and didn't offer too much either. Just enough. Thomas was more. I'm frightened too, I admitted, but perhaps that's appropriate. He smiled, and the apprehension in his eyes softened. We spent the remainder of the afternoon discussing things we rarely voiced aloud. The grief that never disappears but changes form over time. The aspects of ourselves we'd concealed for years. The dreams we had buried so deeply we forgot they still lived. And gradually, a picture emerged, not of a love story written in bold, dramatic strokes, but one painted with subtle hues. A story not of second chances, but new beginnings. That weekend, we visited the local market together. Nothing extraordinary, just hands, selected apples, and artisan bread and laughter in the open air. But it felt right, like the kind of ordinary moment that becomes memory. As spring melted into summer, our lives began to intertwine in small, meaningful ways. Morning breakfasts together. Shared puzzles, a new novel left on my porch with a note. Thought you might enjoy this one. We didn't rush. We didn't need to. Real love doesn't always arrive with lightning bolts or grand declarations. Sometimes it comes in quiet footsteps, in a glance across a dinner table, in knowing someone will greet you at the door when the day has been difficult. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching fireflies dance in the tall grass, he reached for my hand again. This time, there was no hesitation from either of us. You know, he said, I believe we found each other precisely when we needed to. I smiled and rested my head against his shoulder. No, I think we chose to see each other when we were finally prepared. He nodded, and the evening wrapped around us like a soft quilt. Not everything had transformed. The world outside continued turning. My garden still needed tending. The clock still moved forward, but inside me, something had opened, and I knew, deep within, that this chapter of my life was no less significant than any that came before. In fact, perhaps it was the beginning of most honest chapter yet, one built not on youth or timing or perfection, but on understanding, on courage, on the quiet magic of 2 people who had lived enough to finally recognize what truly matters. And so, to anyone listening, I say this: don't surrender hope for connection. Don't close the door on something simply because it arrived later than expected. Sometimes the most unexpected gesture becomes the beginning of everything.